There are surely many people who will claim that we are all the same and there are no races, but that simply isn't true. There are obviously different races of people. You see them every day. You interact with them. We're here, different races of humanity. The problem isn't in our differences. The problem is that we focus on them in a negative light instead of celebrating them. These are 15 questions you should ask about who you really are. Question number one: where do people come from? Or more specifically, where do races come from? Another name for race is nation or nationality. This describes the numerous genetic variances that lead to the multiple collection of organized clusters of DNA or haplotypes. The technical definition of a haplotype is a group of genes in an organism that are inherited together from a single parent, and a haplogroup is a group of similar haplotypes that share a common ancestor with a single nucleotide polymorphism mutation. In layman's terms, the haplotype of a person is the genetic brand placed on your DNA by your ancestors. All males come from a Y chromosome and all females from an X chromosome. The Y chromosome is transferred from father to son unbroken throughout their generations. Mutations occur and alter that DNA, which changes the shape of the brand. This is the paternal side of everyone's DNA, and the maternal side is from the mother and found in the mitochondrial DNA, which goes unbroken from mother to daughter. Although both the maternal and the paternal chromosomes function in a similar fashion, one has a distinct advantage: the Y chromosome. The mitochondria will only show you the normal values of your ancestry and any insertions or deletions of genetic code, but the Y chromosome displays the normal values as well as ancestral. This is a simple chart displaying how a Y chromosome and X chromosome functions to create male and females. As said earlier, they function in a similar capacity. However, generationally, or your lineage is going to come from your father. Therefore, the race or the nation of a person is based on the ancestral lineage of that person's DNA, not the phenotype or skin color and the location of that individual, but specifically the haplogroup to which they belong to. Let's take these two for example. On the right, you have Bob Marley. On the left, Mariah Carey. Now, Bob Marley's father was European. He has a European haplotype. However, his phenotype, he looks black. That doesn't change the fact of who he is. He is from his father's haplotype. So he is of European descent with a dark phenotype. Mariah Carey, on the other hand, she has a black father or an African haplotype. So even though she's very fair skinned, she has very light hair, and you would look at her and assume she is white, she is, however, black by her father's haplotype. Question 2: which haplogroup do I belong to? The only way to know an individual's haplogroup is via a Y chromosome DNA test. The mitochondria will not yield the lineage of an individual, which can only be done from the Y haplo, which is transferred from father to son. There are many companies and organizations, TV shows that advocate using the mitochondrial or the mtDNA to detect a person's lineage. This is not possible. Now, we're not advocating any particular test to use on this video. What we're saying is that you must stick to a Y chromosome DNA test. The mitochondrial will give you too many varying percentages. You can have common mitochondrial DNA in Africa, Asia, Europe, all over. To know what group you belong to, and thus that genetic brand that marks your people or your nation, you must use a Y chromosome. The only way to know the Y haplogroup of a female is to test her father, brother, or some other male with a common male ancestor, such as a first cousin. The female passes on her X chromosomes to her offspring, but since the female does not have a Y chromosome, it isn't passed on. This is where your mtDNA comes from, your mitochondrial, the female or the X chromosome. Question 3. What does it even matter what haplogroup I belong to? Knowing where you are from can often give insight into who you are today, including your struggles and triumphs, as well as the course you are on towards the future. Without an understanding of history, many mistakes can be repeated without ever learning from them and growing. Understanding history isn't holding on to hate or remembering evil. It is simply remembering what happened before and shaping your understanding based on those circumstances. Humans typically function from a learned behavior perspective, while most from the insect kingdom utilize inherited behavior. Insects are born with the ability to spin, spider webs and build nests and everything else. Some animals are as well. But humans must learn how to function and survive from caregivers or progenitors. Therefore, if you do not know where you're from, your sense of identity, understanding of the world, and often how to interact within that world will suffer. Everyone should have some ties to their ancestral roots to understand who they are today and what path they are currently heading on. Question number 4. How do I discover where my ancestors come from? There are numerous ways to discover your ancestral roots. The DNA test is just a start. Knowing your specific haplogroup will not tell you where it originated from. There are many people who have done studies and have videos and do seminars and TED Talks. I suggest checking out a gentleman called Dr. Yehoshua Ben Ephraim. He has a YouTube channel and there's information, he has published information. But a study of the spread of haplogroups will definitely aid in this endeavor of discovering your ancestry. But a study of history and archaeology will have to be included in order to yield any meaningful results. This contemporary era has propagated the notion of an Aryan model of history, which is in contrast. This contemporary or modern era has propagated the notion of an Aryan model of history, which is in contrast to the ancient model that existed long before it. The source of the English word Aryan comes from the Sanskrit word Arya, which is the self-designation used by the Vedic Indic people who migrated into the Indian subcontinent about 1500 BCE or before the Common Era. The Sanskrit term has a cognate in the Iranian word Arya, which is also a self-designation. The out of Africa theory is the most widely accepted model describing the origin and early dispersal of anatomically modern human. This is the Aryan model of history. It supposes that all life originated from the Caucasus Mountains or the Caucasus region of Anatolia or present-day Turkey. This directly contradicts modern-day science and the ancient record of where all life originated, or the out of Africa theory. As the former Fellow of King's College at Cambridge and Cornell professor Martin Bernal wrote, quote, "The ancient model was the conventional view among Greeks in the classical and Hellenistic ages. According to it, Greek culture had arisen as the result of colonization around 1500 BCE by Egyptians and Phoenicians who civilized the native inhabitants." End quote. The understanding of history must come from accounts of those from that time. Otherwise, it's purely speculative and loosely based on information available, and is going to include a large amount of bias. The civilizations of the ancient world gave detailed and written accounts of genealogy, history, culture, and much more. In this modern day, we have accepted the revised Aryan model of history, and thus who we are ancestrally over the tried and true models that existed before. In other words, today we form what we believe happened over 5,000 years ago based on the accounts of people who lived about 200 years ago, and we ignore what the people who actually lived 5,000 years ago said. Question 5. Why should we trust what the ancient world has to say instead of modern scholars' views? The most logical reason to accept the ancient model of history over the Aryan or contemporary model is proximity, as the authors were much closer to the events accounted than those who lived 5,000 years later. Another key reason is the lack of knowledge of the regions that revised the model. Let's just take one of the most widely disputed of the ancient civilizations, KHAMET or Egypt, depending on the period you're talking about. For example, modern Egyptology started around the 19th century in the early 1800s CE, or the Common Era. In the 19th century CE, nearly 90% of Europe was illiterate. There were indeed read men and scholars, but the society overall was not, as a whole, well read, and thus ill equipped to totally alter the model of history that stood nearly 5,000 years prior. Another issue is the racism of the time. What we have in the efforts by the contemporary world is a successful attempt to rewrite history, and this process had a 3-point pyramid system that was required to be included for it to succeed. The first point of that pyramid is progress, or the theory that the more recent the civilization or understanding, then the more modern they were, which meant they had to be better. The second is revisionism, or the attempt to change the understanding or ideas of history that existed prior into something new. Finally, and the cornerstone of all of this, is racism, which was exemplified in the thought process that the darker or black races could not have possibly given rise to civilization, regardless of what the ancient historians claimed or archaeology or anything else, and the reason why scholars such as Bernal, which I agree with, refer to the modern model of history as the Aryan model because it's based on the notion of the manifest destiny of the white man or his divine role of civilizing the world. This is summed up in another quote by Martin Bernal. Quote, "If I am right in urging the overthrow of the Aryan model and its replacement by the revised ancient one, it will be necessary not only to rethink the fundamental basis of Western civilization, but also to recognize the penetration of racism and the continental chauvinism into all our historiography or philosophy of writing history. The ancient model had no major eternal deficiencies or weaknesses in explanatory power. It was overthrown for external reasons." End quote. These external reasons he's referring to is just what I listed above: progress, revisionism, and racism. Question 6. How do we know that the Aryan model, with racism as its cornerstone, affected our current view of history? This is clearly evident today in how we view ancient civilizations who were definitely black or melanated, such as Egypt and other nations or races who were in the Levant region of Africa. This is the Levant region of Africa, that region between the Nile and the Euphrates River of the Arabian Peninsula. The term Middle East is a contemporary one, applied in the 20th century CE, or the Common Era. This term Middle East may have originated in the 1850s in the British India Office. However, it became more widely known when the American naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan used the term in 1902 to designate the area between Arabia and India. The Euphrates River was a dividing line between Africa and Asia. That is where ancient Mesopotamia or Sumer existed, and it empties out into the Persian Gulf. This was the natural border for the two continents of Africa and Asia. The Suez Canal did not exist as a man made canal, it did not exist in the ancient world. There only existed the Red Sea. That region had always been known as the Levant or Northeast Africa. Everything to the west of the Euphrates River was always Africa. To the east of the Euphrates was Asia. To the north of the Caucasus Mountains was Europe. You had Asia Minor, or present day Turkey, which was Anatolia then in the ancient world, as a dividing natural buffer as well. So that whole region of Asia was separated by Asia Minor and the Euphrates River. The term Caucasian, for example, refers to a Caucasus Asian. This was an Asian person who dwelled in the Caucasus region. The entire Levant region was black. This is artwork on the left from the ancient people who lived there during the Media Persian invasion in the 6th century CE, or Common Era. It depicts Koresh, or Cyrus the Great. Koresh, or Cyrus, is recorded in the historical record of Persia in ancient cuneiform script, and he lived from 580 to 530 BCE, or before Common Era. Later in the 5th century BCE, during the empire of Darius, or Darius, who lived from 550 to 486 BCE and died in current day Iran, the Persians expanded their empire to include the Nile Delta region of KHAMET, or what is commonly known today as Egypt. The Persian Empire's reign concluded with them being conquered by the Greeks, or Macedonians, led by Alexander, a people whom the Persians themselves had invaded before and was ruling during the time of the historian Herodotus. Both Cyrus, or Koresh, and Darius, or Darius, have the appearance of what you would call a Middle Eastern person today. The people of the Middle East today are not genetically Arabs. The Arabs were black, the same as all of the Levant people prior to the Persian Empire invasion. Some will still argue this fact today. But again, this forces the revision of history and the total neglect of what the people of the time had to say, because we obviously have to be smarter. Take the example of Aelius Gallienus, or Claudius Gallienus, who is typically referred to as Galen of Pergamon, who was a Greek physician, philosopher, and a surgeon in the Roman Empire and lived from 129 to 210 CE. He died in Italy. He states, quote, "In Ethiopians, Arabs, and all other southern peoples, the skin has been roasted by the ambient heat and by the effect of internal heat being drawn outwards, and so becomes hard, dry, and black." This is a doctor from 2,000 years ago, and he clearly states that Arabs and Ethiopians have the same phenotype, which is black. The majority of the people who inhabit the Levant region today are Persians, Medes, and Babylonians, or Shia, Kurds, and Sunni, respectively. Most of the people in Iran and Syria still refer to themselves as Persian today. They are Muslims by religion, but Persian by descent. Ancient Babylon, which is chronologically after ancient Sumer, is located in present day Iraq. It used to be called Uruk. Saddam Hussein, a Sunni by nationality, is a direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, or the ancient ruler of Babylon in the early 7th century BCE. He lived from 605 to 562 BCE. This is why there was such a demand of a three-state solution to the division of Iraq after Saddam Hussein was deposed. The Sunni, Shia, and Kurds, or Babylonians, Persians, and Medes respectively, they have held on to their identity for millennia, and they refuse to allow any other nation to rule over them from the three. There was no such thing as a Middle East, and the phenotype or skin color of those who dwelled in that region was as melanated as all other African nations or races, which included parts of Asia. At the end of the Persian and Greek rule of the Levant region, most other nations who originated there were pushed further into Africa, while many people of each conquering nation remained. This exacerbated after the Romans conquered the Greeks and then the Vikings after them. Always, even today, you will see a pushing when during wartime of people from the region further into Africa. When the trouble erupted in Syria, where they go? They went further into Africa. Anytime there's a problem around the Gaza Strip, where do they go? Further into Africa. No one typically goes north towards the Caucasus Mountains. It is just not done. Only now in the time of Syria, through their conflict, do you see this happen, which is causing a great destabilization of the world. Many of the artworks in ancient Kemet have been defamed and vandalized. Some of it was due for resources, but a large portion of it was due to distort or change the appearance of the statues, always around the nose and the lips regions. Many people and civilizations over years have had a problem with coming to grips with the fact that ancient Kemet was a black nation. Vivant Denon, a French writer, artist, diplomat, author, and archaeologist, sketched the Sphinx prior to its defamation and witnessed the events and wrote about the Sphinx. Quote, though its proportions are colossal, the outline is pure and graceful. The expression of the head is mild, gracious, and tranquil. The character is clearly African, a female, but the mouth and lips of which are thick has a softness and delicacy of execution truly admirable. End quote. The pervasiveness of this Aryan model is evident even in modern cinema today. Many have seen the countless movies where they simply replace people of color. An argument is often made that revenue would suffer with more accurate casting, even though people of color are the number one consumers in America. But that's not the point. Let's take the movie Troy, for example. This is a movie about the Trojan War as was recorded by the poet Homer. As you can see or have known, the picture on the left or the bottom left picture right here depicts Eric Bana, Brad Pitt, Diane Kruger, and Orlando Bloom. Totally all white cast for the movie Troy. Fair, light people. This tale was accounted in the Iliad, Odyssey, and Aethiopus. Most have heard about the Iliad and the Odyssey, but many have no idea about the Aethiopus. It means the Song of the Ethiopians or the Battle of the Blacks in Greek. The Ethiopians, or Aethiopians as it was referred to in Greek, were the Egyptians in this tale, and they were the ones who actually pushed the Greeks back to their boats. This is the section where Achilles is shot in the heel and the Greeks used the Trojan horse. No one ever saw one African in that entire movie, but they were integral to the story, including the fact that the Egyptian king, who was called Memnon in the account of Homer, was a nephew of Priam, the king of Troy. So in this middle picture here, you depict the Ethiopian or the African Egyptian soldier actually defeating the Greek soldier and pottery from Greece. In the third pottery piece, you see Memnon depicted in the middle. The statue on the left, this bust is a depiction of Memnon, the Egyptian or Ethiopian pharaoh who went to aid his uncle Priam. The picture on the right is the guy who played Priam. But he's supposed African pharaoh? It doesn't even make sense. Memnon is the one who actually had single combat with Achilles, not Hector. So it shouldn't have anything to do with Eric Bana. It should have been, I don't know, Wesley Snipes or any one of the other numerous black actors who could have played that role. This revisionism is even present here in stories where Africans are required for the story. They simply remove Memnon and they change the whole story to get around it. This brings us to question 7. Does this mean the Egyptians were black? The ruling class of Egypt were not necessarily black or even a dark people overall. Egypt is the name given by the Greeks when they conquered Khamet or Kemet for the city of Hot-Ka-Ptah, or the temple of the spirit of Ptah. This city was Hellenized into Egypta and later into Egyptos. Hellenized just simply means to be Greek. Hellenistic kingdoms were Greek ran or Greek dominated regions. Today, this city is commonly known worldwide as the city of Memphis. So basically, the Greeks showed up in the 4th century BCE, before Common Era, and destroyed the Persian Empire, who had destroyed the Shemitic or Semitic empires before them and displaced them. They then went on to conquer KHAMET. After the land had functioned for 3,000 years, the Greeks decided not to keep the name KHAMET, which means land of the blacks. They therefore changed it to Egypt or Egyptos, as was their right as conquerors. When Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, came to rule in this new vassal kingdom of Egypt, he found it wise to assimilate to the older, more rich culture, as the Greeks had only been truly organized as a nation under Macedonian rule since about the 5th century CE. In comparison to this newly obtained vast knowledge, they were babies. Ptolemy installed himself as the new pharaoh of Egypt. He built a new capital at Alexandria, a city which he named after his former king. And since, according to Herodotus, who was a historian that actually lived in the 5th century BCE, from 484 to 425 BCE, and is known as the father of history, when the father of history speaks of the many Greek ritual customs of his day, he states that, quote, these practices then and others which I will speak of later were borrowed by the Greeks from Egypt. End quote. When speaking of even the names of the gods of Greece, he said, quote, long afterwards the names of the gods were brought into Greece from Egypt, and the Pelasgians learnt them. End quote. He went on to speak on the Greeks' familiarity with the gods and stated, quote, but it was only, if I may so put it, the day before yesterday that the Greek came to know the origin and the form of the various gods, and whether or not at all of them had always existed. End quote. So it's quite clear. The Greeks got their entire pantheon from the people of Kemet. And this explains why they simply named their deity Zeus Amon, whereas the Aryan model will have you believe that Ptolemy arrived in Kemet and emerged with what the Greeks were already doing seamlessly into what was in place for 3,000 years prior. This era of Ptolemy's dynasty is known as the Ptolemaic period, acknowledging the 300-year Greek rule that began with Alexander the Great and ended with the suicide of Queen Cleopatra in 30 BCE. There were many non-black Egyptians of this empire. Question 8. So why is it that people claim that Egyptians or ancient Egypt was black? This is because the civilization that existed 3,000 years prior to Egypt or Egyptos was KHAMET or Kemet, and they were a dark-skinned or melanated people. The Encyclopedia Britannica states that Ramses died in 1156 BCE, Thebes, Egypt. He was the king of ancient Egypt and reigned from 1187 to 1156 BCE. He ruled at the height of Egypt's power, and he's heralded as the greatest of all Egyptian kings. He descended or was the forefather, the progenitor of Tutankhamun or King Tut. This individual was genetically an African and belonged to an African haplogroup. Genetically, Pharaoh Ramses III was of an African haplogroup, haplogroup E. These are from 2 peer-reviewed papers, but there are many more about the DNA of Ramses III if you are so inclined to see for yourself. This was a direct descendant of Tutankhamun or King Tut. When looking at all this information and while you peruse it, it can be overwhelming. But the important thing to get from it are a few points. One is that haplogroup E1B1A, known as EM2, is an African DNA group, most commonly found in sub-Saharan Africa. When they tested Ramses III, his DNA was EM2. It was called originally E1B1A, but what happened was the haplogroup mutated. The brand changed. And when that changed, the group who was in that region, not in Egypt, but who were in the Levant region, they also became E1B1A. So Ramsey's group is now E1B1B or EM2, and Sub-Saharan or West Coast Africa, the African Americans, Negroes of the Sea, all those people, they are E1B1A. Ramsey's mummy is consistent with the appearance of someone of that haplogroup, the E haplogroup. He looks black or African. This picture here on the right is a depiction of Ramses III. He is clearly an African male. His phenotype is similar with others of the E1B1 haplogroup. The haplogroup E1B1 now contains two basal branches. E1B1A, as I said, is West Coast, Central, and Southern Africa. E1B1B is East Coast and parts of Northern Africa. These are two of the most famous mummies and rulers of KHAMET. On the left, you have King Tut, who is Tutankhamun, or the son of Akhenaten, the beginning of the New Kingdom. And on the right, you have Ramses III. This is his actual mummy right there. Now, people will look at that, his mummy, and say, you see, there is blonde or a reddish hair, a hue to his hair. This means that he was obviously European, of course. However, again, this causes you to totally revise history and flies in the face of scientific data. This gentleman depicted next to Ramses clearly has an African phenotype. He clearly has a lighter color hair. The same thing can be said for Tutankhamun's doppelganger here. He clearly has a dark or the similar phenotype of someone of an E haplogroup. Other mummies from KHAMET have a similar phenotype of someone of that haplogroup. Their hair, texture, thickness, quality, and their actual color of their skin or shade, it depicts someone who is of the E haplogroup. These are examples of white or Caucasian mummies. Not white as in Anglos, but as I said, in Caucasians or Caucasus Asians. These are the Tarim mummies that were found in the Tarim Basin in present-day Xinjiang, China. They date from 1800 BCE to the first centuries of BCE. So, if this is what someone of fair complexion looks like after being mummified for 4,000 years, why do we even begin to try to equate these people to the same people who lived in ancient Kemet when we clearly can see their ancestry, their DNA, and their history, frankly, on their walls? The genetic descendants of these people are not extinct. They exist today and are the tribes such as the Beja and others in East Africa, the Sudanese, Somalians, Ethiopians, Libyans, etc. These are the people of Kemet. They exist on the walls of the kingdoms they built. They clearly depicted what they felt they looked like. These are all depictions of the ancient people of Kemet. These are not Egyptians. These are the people who ruled thousands of years prior to the Greek Potomac Empire. They have a dark copper tone to their skin. They have crinkly, curly hair, dark, jet black, easily seen. This is what they look like today. This is an example of some of the Nubian tribes, and some of them were rulers in Kemet as well. As you can see, this young lady on the right clearly is a direct descendant of those images on the left. And you can see the images on the left have a variation in skin hue, going from a copper lighter to jet black even. This is what they look like today. As you can see from the stone relief, the gentleman on the right directly reflects it's a carbon copy. This is his descendant, his ancestry. They know who they are. They still hold on to a lot of the customs and rituals and things of their forefathers. The Aryan model will have you believe that we have no idea who these people were or what color they were or where they came from or any of that, which is total nonsense. There is a direct record. We have a historical account. Again, let us go to the father of history, Herodotus, and see what he has to say on their appearance. Some people have tried to take his words out of context or twist them to make them say something other than what they actually do. This is another example of this Aryan model logic. It can't be true. He can't mean what he said. We'll just twist up what he said. So Herodotus spoke of a people called the Kokins who lived near current day Georgia. As you can see on the map, that is near, not far from the Caucasus Mountains, but closer to Anatolia. All right. So this is a direct quote of Herodotus. This is a direct quote from Herodotus. Quote, but it is undoubtedly a fact that Kokins are of Egyptian descent. End quote. Page 134, line 104 of Herodotus, The Histories. Now, Herodotus is speaking to the fact that in his time, the claim was that they were from Sesostris' army. Sesostris is censoret or censoret, however you want to describe it, or verbalize that name. But this was a mighty ruler of ancient Kemet who ruled during the Middle Kingdom and at the height of the Middle Kingdom in ancient Kemet. He goes on, quote, my own idea on the subject was based first on the fact that they have black skin and woolly hair. Not that that amounts to much, as other nations have the same. And secondly, and more especially, on the fact that the Kokins, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only races which from ancient times have practiced circumcision. End quote. So Herodotus is lumping all of this group as the same phenotype together. The Kokins, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians. If we understand that we all agree that the ancient Ethiopians were and still are an African or a dark phenotype group, we have to go with the logical assumption that Herodotus is saying the same for these other two groups as well. Some promoting the Aryan model will claim that Herodotus wasn't speaking of black or dark skinned people in spite of the DNA, archaeological, and historical evidence to the contrary. They will claim that he was speaking of a thick haired people with darker than a white phenotype or skin tone, like you would see in Greece today or what you would see in Georgia today. Now, this simply doesn't work with the translation, as the word used there was melancros to denote the black skin of all those nations. The root of melancros is melas, which means black in Greek, and is the etymological root of the English word melanin. Herodotus thought all three of those nations that he listed to be of melis or melancro complexion or phenotype with woolly hair who, unlike all other peoples, solely practiced circumcision, which was a common trait or practice ritual in the Levant region among those dark people of the Levant region. Question 9. Does this mean that black people originated from ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet? Many people designated as African American hold on to the belief that they are black and thus descended from ancient Kemet. But that is as Arrhenius is saying all Europeans are white. Europeans have many similar phenotypes or skin colors, but they are different nations of people based on genetics, history, culture, etc. Italians and Scottish people, for example, are not the same nation. Therefore, to state that all black people originated from ancient Kemet flies in the face of genetics and history. Those who are designated as African or Afro-American and Negroes in the Caribbean and South Americas are nearly 90% E1B1A, or what is currently designated as Sub-Saharan Africans, which are Africans who currently live in the south of the Sahara Desert. The descendants of ancient Kemet have a similar but different haplotype as Sub-Saharan Africans, or E1B1A. They have a similar phenotype or skin color as well, but they are two different nations of people, just like the Scottish people and the Italians are. The tribes of Kemet or ancient Egypt are typically in the E1B1B haplogroup, as explained in the previous slides, and they comprise the black or melanated people of North and East Africa. Haplogroup E1B1 has the two basal branches, and E1B1A designates those who are south of the Sahara. But the point is, if Ramses has E1B1 and he lived in ancient Kemet, this is hardcore proof that that haplogroup could not have originated south of the Sahara. It had to originate closer to Egypt or the Levant region. Analysis of modern Egyptians, the people who live there now, proves that their paternal lineages are common to indigenous and other Afro-Asiatic speaking populations in Northeast and Northwest Africa, which include Maghreb and Horn of Africa. So these people have a paternal lineage which goes back to E1B1B and to Middle Eastern peoples to a lesser extent. So this study is showing that Middle Eastern peoples have a lesser extent of the ancient Egyptians' Y chromosomal group. These lineages would have spread during the Neolithic and were maintained by the pre-dynastic period. So this E1B1A, or the haplogroup that was from ancient Kemet, spread out. And from there, other haplogroups formed and organized. As stated before, the modern day descendants of the ancient land of Khamet carry with them the customs and histories of their ancestors. Some of these tribes are even able to read the hieroglyphics, which according to them are a shorthand form that all nations of Kemet, such as Ethiopia or Kush, Libya or Put, and what we currently call Egypt or Misraim, could recognize and communicate with. Ancient Kemet was not simply ruled by Egyptians, but Ethiopia or Kush had multiple rulers in Kemet, as did the Libyans and obviously the ancient Egyptians themselves. The reason the name Khamet or Kemet is used for the region is not only because the people were all dark, but also because they are stemmed from a progenitor named Kham, who originated their haplogroup. In Eastern cultures, names have meaning. People will often change their name to signify events or places, as well as name places after individuals. The names are almost always verbs with a distinct purpose. An example of this is the Ghanaian culture, which is Eastern and belonging to the haplogroup E1B1A. A female who was born on Sunday will be called a Kosua, which literally means born on Sunday. Kham is an ancient Hebraic or Hebrew word which is translated as ham in English. As you can see, this is a simple Strong's concordance. It's a way of matching languages on a numerical form so that you can tell what other people are saying. So if everyone is saying hat, it will be called number 50, for example. Therefore, if you called it a lid, I called it a hat, and someone else called it a top, we will all understand what each other are saying. So, as you can see, 2526 is Kham. Kham is a son of Noah. This is a part of the ancient Hebrew or Hebrew account of things, which you would call the Bible or scriptures. Also, his descendant, also named for the Egyptians. You see, Kham is a name for the Egyptians because of KHAMET. This is the original word written in their language. Parts of speech, proper name, masculine person, location. The phonetic spelling is calm. Short definition, ham. The same as calm, hot, from tropical habitat. Calm, a son of Noah, also as a patronymic or a patriarch, his descendants of their country. According to the scholars and historians, Kham means ancient Kemet. His name meant black from the sun or tropical heat. The records or the scriptures of the ancient EIB'RIM or the ancient Hebrew people, it's a history book. It's more of a catalog. The Bible, as people like to call it in Western circles, is the oldest history account of humanity. Most people will go to this record and test any theories about history based off of this. So the scriptures of the ancient EIB'RIM or Hebrews has been used by many for religious purposes. But it is at its core, like I said, a history book with amazing accuracy. Even if one is unable or unwilling to read and see the spiritual account of the writings, you cannot help but appreciate the validity of its historical record. In the genealogical record of Noach or Noah, according to the ancient EIB'RIM, he had three sons: Kam or the Kemetic people, which is Hamitic; Shem or Shemitic people, which we now call Semitic; and Japhet, which made up the peoples of Europe and Asia, or the Persians, Greeks, Medes, etc. Kam had four sons, which started four nations of people: Cush, or the ancient Kushite Empire, Ethiopia; Misraim, or the ancient Egyptians, or ancient Kemet, Beja, Sudanese, etc.; Put, or the ancient Libyans, which are the Libyans today; Canaan, or the ancient Canaanites, or the blacks of Palestine. These four nations are still present today, and their DNA, oral and written history, and the archaeological record all attest to their lineage. This is an example of Libyans. This is a map of Put, Libya, Misraim, Egypt, Cush, Ethiopia. They're still there. This is not like dinosaurs or the dodo bird, okay? They still exist. Question 10. If the Afro or African American haplogroup did not originate from ancient Kemet, nor from the south of the Sahara Desert, where did it originate from? The E1B1A haplogroup is Shemitic or Semitic in origin. Afro-Shemitic people are those of the Levant who, according to the account of the ancient EIB'RIM, which is the oldest genealogical record, were descended from Noach's son Shem. The Hebraic record of genealogy of Shem is that he had five sons, which started five nations of people: Elam, or the ancient Elamites, who are attested to in the art of their cities, such as Den Shari; Asher, or the ancient Assyrians, prior to the Medo-Persian invasion and the renaming to Syria; Apraxad, or the ancient Akkadians; Lud, the Lydians, or ancient Laudites, who were the people of the Anatolia region, or Turkey; Aram, or the ancient Arameans, or the Ugaritic people, who were also around the Anatolia region or Turkey. Generally, E1B1A haplogroup members are descendants from these groups of people, but more specifically, they are from the ancient EIB'RIM or ancient Hebrews, which were a small subset of Akkadian and Ugaritic tribes. The Bantu peoples, which nearly all E1B1A, African American, Negro, Caribbean, blacks, etc., are comprised of, are the ancient IB'RIM or ancient Hebrews. When examining what the ancient historians wrote, a look at Publius or Gaius Cornelius Tacitus must be made. He lived from 56 to 120 CE or the Common Era. He's typically called Tacitus and was a senator and a historian of the Roman Empire. The surviving portions of his two major works, the Annals and the Histories, examine the reigns of the Roman emperors Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and those who reigned in the year of these four emperors, which was around 69 CE. These two works span the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus in 14 CE to the years of the First Judean-Roman War, which ended in 70 CE. He writes about Jerusalem or Jerusalem being destroyed, and the people or inhabitants thereof, and the speculations about them. He wasn't a fan. Anyone who reads his work, you'll see that he wasn't a fan of the Judeans or the Judeans. He simply gave what he thought or what was the general consensus of his time. When looking in History's Book 5, paragraph 2, he stated, talking about the Jews or the Yehudim, quote, many again say that they were a race of Ethiopian origin, end quote. This historian is accounting that a lot of people thought that these Judeans were all Ethiopian, or if you read other parts of the chapter, Egyptian, which we've already covered, were black. One Bantu tribe in particular that was genetically tested by multiple organizations was the Lemba tribe of South Africa, who have always maintained that they were the ancient IB'RIM and were in fact largely priests or Kohanim. A study published by PBS, a link is provided here, quote, the Center for Genetic Anthropology at University College London took a look for a genetic counterpart to the Lemba's oral tradition of Jewish descent. Using a relatively new technique in genetic studies, Y-chromosomal haplotypes, the team identified a particular series of genetic markers on the Y chromosome of the Lemba males. They then compared these markers to other groups with whom the Lemba might have shared a common ancestor long ago. The team collected DNA samples from Bantu, Africans, Yemeni, Arab, and Sephardic Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews, including Kohanim from both communities, to compare the amount of similarity that existed between each of these groups. As we've seen, the more similar the Y chromosome, the more closely related are some individuals in different groups to a common paternal ancestor. As a consequence, one can establish links between populations. The Kohanim gene that the Jews use today to determine their priest, that's what Kohanim mean, priests. A Kohen is a priest singular. It's only found in about 2% of their population. This Y chromosome is said to be directly passed down from Aharon or Aaron, who was the brother of Moshe or Moses, and the line of Kohanim or priest. The Lemba tribe not only had the gene, but they had it in far higher concentrations than those of the Jewish populations of the world. Whereas they only have the Y chromosome present in their Kohanim or in roughly 2%, 2 to 3% fairly, of their population, this Bantu tribe alone had it dispersed in their entire group. This is noted in a peer-reviewed published study. In an interview with Nova, team member Dr. David Goldstein commented on the team's findings. Quote, the first striking thing about the Y chromosomes of the Lemba is that you find that this particular chromosomal type, the Kohen modal haplotype, that is characteristic of the Jewish priesthood and a frequency that is similar to what you see in major Jewish populations. Something just under 1 out of every 10 lemba that we looked at had this particular Y chromosomal type that appears to be a signature of Jewish ancestry. Perhaps even more striking is the fact that this Cohen genetic signature is strongly associated with a particular clan of the Lemba. Most of the Cohen modal haplotypes that we observe are carried by the individuals of the Buba clan in Lemba oral traditions had a leadership role in bringing the Lemba out of Israel. End quote. So the link to the post is right here at the bottom of this slide. And what is being said is, whereas the entire Jewish population over the entire world, all 14 to 15 million of them, it's only 2 to maybe 3% that have this Cohen haplotype. Whereas when you went to this one tribe, 10% of them, 1 in 10, or 10% of them had it. That's 5 times higher concentration than the entire worldwide Jewish population in one African Bantu tribe. Genetically, the Lemba are Bantu and a part of the E1b1a haplogroup. The genetic link between the ancient IB'RIM and the E1b1a haplogroup is well documented and attested to in Jewish media as well as the Jewish Post. Question 11. If the ancient IB'RIM or Hebrews were black or a dark-skinned people, why are the Jewish people of today so light? First, it is important to understand that a phenotype or skin color is something that can be easily altered in 3 generations. This is emphasized in the book by Arbor Octavius Neville, Australia's Colored Minority is Placed in the Community. He was a senior bureaucrat in Western Australia from 1915 to 1940 CE, and a national figure in Aboriginal affairs during that period. His writings were representative of the thinking of many social aspects of that time period. First, let us notice how this model calls for using a full-blooded Aboriginal woman and a full-blooded Irish male. This is because the haplotype of the father would be imprinted on any sons, and in the very next generation, the half Aboriginal child, if a woman, would join her genetic information with a full-blooded Irish man. If the child of the half Aboriginal woman and the half Irish man happened to be male, they would often just disregard the child. This practice is common when genetically assimilating a nation. Afterwards, when a male offspring of the half Aboriginal woman and the half Irish male is produced, the child will have the haplotype of the father and thus be of his nation or race. This method continues the haplogroup of the father, which is Irish, and the phenotype or color of the Aboriginal woman is quickly bred out, resulting in an assimilation and destruction of the Aboriginal haplotype. A.O. Neville ingeniously exhibited that it would only take 3 generations for the lineage of Aboriginal Australians to be acceptably integrated into European society. This is because the phenotype would be indistinguishable from others of Scottish descent after 3 generations. Many of these same practices were used on indigenous populations or people from many different lands, and is commonly referred to today as the whitening out or whitening of a population. Now that we understand how easily a phenotype of a people can be altered, we can now focus on the ancestry of the Jews. The Jewish people can be broken down into 3 groups. Ashkenazi, which are 75% of the Jewish population. These are your German Jews, and they are about 12 million worldwide. Sephardic, they're about 16% of the Jewish population, and these are your Spain or Portugal Jews, and are about 2 million worldwide. Then you have Mizrahi. They are less than 10% of the population and are Middle Eastern Jews and number anywhere from just under a million to just over 1 million. Now that we understand the groups that make up the Jewish population, we have to consider a few facts. One is that the letter J is only 500 years old. So there were no Jews more than about 500 years ago. The term Yahudim, which means basically Jews in different dialects, is what was attributed to the tribe of ancient Yisraelites or ancient Israelis. These people were of the Shemitic origins listed earlier. This is haplogroup E. The Jews' haplogroups are G, J, and R, as in the Anglo and Persian Mede Babylonians or Shia Kurd and Sunnis. So you have your Anglos who are R, and this is typically your Western European. Some of the Italians and other Western European countries share this haplogroup. This is the haplogroup that transformed after the Anglo incursion into the land. You have J. This is typically the Middle Eastern haplogroup. As discussed earlier, these are your Persians, Medes, Babylonians. And you have the one we haven't discussed yet is G. Now, at the level of national populations, GM210 is most commonly found in Georgia. We discussed Georgia earlier, where the Colchian region. This is near the Caucasus Mountains. It is found at even higher levels among many other regional and minority populations in the Caucasus. GM210 is also widely distributed at low frequencies among ethnic groups of Europe, South Asia, Central Asia, and North Africa. With a deeper understanding of the origin of haplogroup G, we can look at haplogroup R, RM17 or R1A, and RP25 or R1B are present in non-Ashkenazi Jewish populations. An example at 4% and 10% respectively, and in non-Jewish Near Eastern populations at 7% and 11% respectively. It is likely that they were also present at low frequency in Ashkenazi Jewish founding population. So these haplotypes were at the Ashkenazi Jewish foundation. The paper is Hammer et al. 2000, Nabel et al. 2001. About 5 to 8% of the Ashkenazi gene pool is indeed comprised of Y chromosomes that may have introgressed from non-Jewish European populations. Also, 7% of Ashkenazi have the haplogroup G2. Bahar et al. Suggests that those haplogroups are minor Ashkenazi Jews founding lineages. As stated, haplogroup G is from present-day Georgia. These are the ancient people of Samaria. Pretty sure people have heard of the tale of Conan. Conan was a Sumerian. That's who the Jews are, Caucasus region people. Here are 3 peer-reviewed published studies for sources. As always, prove all things. So at any time, write any of this information down and go check it out for yourself. The papers were listed before as well as the others, all right here. Take your time, write them down, study for yourself. A recent study done by Inez Nogueiro et al., July 2009, on the Jews of northeastern Portugal, or the Mizrahi Jews, the region of Trás-os-Montes, showed that their paternal father's lines consisted of 35.2% lineages more typical of Europe. There's the breakdown. R is 31, I is 3.5. I is Scandinavian or Anglo, and 64.8% lineages more typical of Near East than Europe. E1B1B, which is talked about before, 8%, G 3%, J 36%, and T 15%. and consequently, the Portuguese Jews of this region were genetically closer to other Jewish population than to Portuguese non-Jews. So there's a correlation between them ancestrally. So these are the same people. They have the same lines. They have the G, they have a large portion of J, and some T. Now, J is the haplotypes of the Persians, the Greeks, all those people who were listed before. Shia, Sunni, all the same people of that same group. The T haplotype is a different origin. Now, this study clearly shows that Mizrahi have mostly a J and a T haplotype. So, where does the T haplotype come from? Haplogroup T is a widespread haplogroup throughout Western and Central Eurasia, with varying degrees of prevalence and certainly might have been present in other groups from the surrounding areas. T is found approximately in 10% of native Europeans. It is also common among modern day Iranians. Based on a sample of over 400 modern day Iranians, there's a study data right there. Look it up for yourself. All published, all peer reviewed. The T haplogroup represents roughly 8.3% of the population, about 1 in 12 individuals, with more specific T1 subtype constituting roughly half of those. Furthermore, the specific T1 tends to be found further east and is common in Central Asian and modern Turkic population. There's a study group right there who inhabit much of the same territory as the ancient Saka, Samaritan, Androvo, and other putative Iranian peoples of the second and first millennia BCE. Same study. Now, the Sumerians are what I was speaking about earlier. These are the Sumerians, as talking about in Conan and such, the ancient Sumerians. So, therefore, according to genetics, the Jews of the world originate from the Caucasus region of Asia. They are Caucasus Asians. University of Huddersfield. mtDNA mitochondrial research confirms the origins of the Ashkenazi Jews. Long-standing controversy settled. DNA shows Ashkenazim female line descendant from southern and western Europe, not the Near East. So the maternal line or the X chromosomal line came from western and southern Europe. It descended from western and southern Europe and not the Near East. Most people would know that Jewish populations tend to be closed societies. They typically only marry other Jewish people and or people who convert over. That's why there's such an interest in people to study genetically, because they do not go outside of their own nation. So this explains. The Scientist is a website that is reputable that publishes scientific data. This talks about a particular study done by a group of scientists trying to figure out how to stop certain genetic diseases. It reads, whole genome sequences from 128 healthy Jewish people could help the medical community identify disease-associated variants in those of Ashkenazi ancestry, according to a study published today, September 9th, in Nature Communications. The Library of Sequences also confirms earlier conclusions about Ashkenazi history hinted at by more limited DNA sequence studies. For instance, the sequences point to an approximate 350-person bottleneck in the Ashkenazi population as recently as 700 years ago, and suggest that the population is an admixture of European and Middle Eastern ancestry. So you have clearly right there the genetic sequencing of the Ashkenaz for purposes of trying to stop diseases showed that about 700 years ago, that shows where they pretty much came from. And as stated before, the letter J does not exist prior to 500 years ago. So when we go into the Khazarian Empire, you can see it all correlates. This is just more tables from the published studies listed before. As you can see up there where the sources are listed, these are the sources. Anyone can look at them for themselves. They're all peer-reviewed scientific studies. This was the identification of the source of the European gene flow within the Ashkenazi genome. Go down to the second paragraph and you'll read, we found that South Europe was the most likely source for the Eastern European component of most of the chromosomes. It's showing the tables of where they all came from. And what you can see is every single one of them are largely amounted from outside of the Levant region. Look at the tables. Ashkenazi, Europe, Middle East. This may seem anti-Semitic or somehow in an attempt to discredit a people's lineage. But in reality, this is just a review of history, without bias, without contempt. Just an honest look at what's there genetically, historically, scientifically, archaeologically, and so forth. These are Jewish people and other people throughout history who can attest to this concept. This is not something that just came about by some crazy group or some black cult or something like that. This is something that has been known about for a very long time. Here we have Arthur Kessler, who is a Hungarian Jewish, or who was a Hungarian Jewish novelist, philosopher, and political activist who lived much of his life in England. He wrote a book on the history of the Jews and claimed that his people originated from Khazarian heritage. Shlomo Sand is an Israeli emeritus professor of history at Tel Aviv University. He's a professor at history in Israel at Tel Aviv. He wrote a book called The Invention of the Jewish People. This claimed that the Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Khazars, who purportedly converted in the early Middle Ages. Both of these books are from Jewish authors and were bestsellers for months in Israel. Benjamin Friedman, who lived from 1890 to 1984 CE. He was a Jewish American businessman in the earliest 20th century CE. He became a staunch anti-Zionist after World War II. He testified before Congress multiple times on the origins of his people, the Jewish people. Here's an excerpt from one of his most famous speeches. Quote, "What are the facts about the Jews? I call them Jews to you because they are known as Jews. I don't call them Jews myself. I refer to them as so-called Jews because I know what they are. The Eastern European Jews, who form 92% of the world's population of those people who call themselves Jews, were originally Khazars. They were a warlike tribe who lived deep in the heart of Asia. And they were so warlike that even the Asiatics drove them out of Asia into Eastern Europe. They set up a large Khazar kingdom of 800,000 square miles. At the time, Russia did not exist, nor did many other European countries. The Khazar kingdom was the biggest country in all Europe, so big and so powerful that when the other monarchs wanted to go to war, the Khazars would lend them 40,000 soldiers. That's how big and how powerful they were." End quote. This is the Khazar kingdom. This is where it lied. Khazaria was basically in the Caucasus region of Asia, or the Caucasus Mountains, right over Georgia, north of Mesopotamia, south of Europe. As stated by Benjamin Friedman, there was no Russia at this point. Notice this is genetically the same region where their haplotypes originated from, according to science. Not bias, not opinion, not anger, not feelings, not religion, just science and history. The English author H.G. Wells. He was famous for writings on multiple genres, including history, the novel, politics, and social commentary. He was born in 1866 and died in London in 1946 of the Common Era, just after World War II. He also commented on the origin of the Jewish people and their connection to the Edomites, who are a Shemitic people, but not the ancient nation of Yisrael or Israel. He stated that the Idumeans or the Edomites were made Jews, and the Turkish people, Khazars, were mainly Jews in South Russia. That's the Caucasus regions we just looked at. The main part of Jewry never was in Judea and had never come out of Judea. Now, I realize that he is an author and he makes up things. I understand all of that. But this just attests to the notion that this wasn't a new concept. A lot of people already understood exactly what had happened. The Edomites or the Idumeans made up that 2% that connected to the people or the Lemba tribe who have the 1 in 10 or 10%. This is the connection to them in the Shemitic past. Henry Ford, the famous American industrialist and automobile manufacturer. He wrote a 4-volume set of booklets or pamphlets published and distributed in the early 1920s called The International Jew, where he discussed the true origin of the Jewish people. Again, many will attest this to anti Semitism, but anti Semitic simply means anti Shemitic. And not everyone is, you cannot say that the people of the land who are over there are anti Shemitic if they have Shemitic origins. And not many of them do, is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you're not a Shemite, you cannot say that someone's being anti Semitic or anti Shemitic towards you. This doesn't, dismiss any of the pains or the atrocities that anyone suffers. This just points out the simple fact: science, history, truth. The ancient IB'RIM or Hebrews did not make statues or graven images of themselves because of strict ritual prohibition, but other nations did. According to the historical count of the IB'RIM, they were taken into captivity or exiled, which basically meant taken into slavery, from their land on multiple occasions, but specifically by two civilizations: the Assyrians or ancient Ashur, which was listed on the Shemitic list given earlier, and the Babylonians or the ancient Sunni, or the people of Uruk or Iraq, which was listed earlier too. So those two nations took them away into slavery. This relief right here can be found in the British Museum of History. This isn't some secret or some type of hidden code or anything like that. This is just what it is. This is a relief of the IB'RIM being taken into captivity from Lachish. This was the northern kingdom of Israel's capital city. Look at the hair. They are Negro or black people. This is a relief of Levites or Levites. These were the priesthood of Yisrael or Israel, one of the 12 tribes whose sole responsibility was to handle music and minister their faith system and handle all of their sacrificial rituals and all that. They are clearly a black people with dreadlocks. This is them in Babylon, inside of the Sunni or Uruk captivity, not depicted by themselves, but what other nations taught. So these are two separate depictions of the same people, and both clearly show them as being black or Negro in appearance. For further emphasis, this is a Babylonian depiction of Elamites being taken into captivity. The Elamites were of Shemitic origin. Elam was one of Shem's sons, as listed earlier. Elamites look Negro. Look at their hair, their beards. You cannot possibly think that these are Caucasians or Caucasians. There's no way. These are ceramic tiles depicting the people of the Levant from the temple of Ramses III, listed earlier from the Encyclopedia Britannica, reigned from 1186 to 1155 BCE, or before Common Era in the 20th dynasty. So during his time, this is what the people of the Levant look like. They're all a thick-lipped, thick-nosed, melanated people with thick woolly hair. All of them clearly depicted. This is a photo of Khazars. The Ashkenazi Jews are largely Caucasians or Caucasus Asians. Remember the mummy showed earlier. Which do they look like? These are not the Anglos or Anglo-Saxons, who are typically referred to as the white nation or the white race. Again, this is not to say one is superior to the other or lesser or inferior. This is just speaking about simple genetics and history. A lot of this stuff gets muddled behind false bravado and shield words that stop people from talking about these things like anti-Semitism and racism. But it's just simple facts. The Ashkenazi Jews make up the largest of the three people that are considered to be Jewish today. This has been proven with sources, all cited, no questions. This is just a fact. Ashkenaz is of the line of Japhet or Japhet in the Hebraic or Hebrew culture. They are not from the line of Shem or a Shemitic, which means Semitic people. Japhet was one of the three sons of Noah who populated the entire world according to the Hebraic account of history. The other two sons of Noah, Shem and Ham, populated what we call Africa, which included the Middle East. Japhet made up those tribes that populated the regions beyond the Caucasus Mountains and the Euphrates. These made up the tribes of the Persians, the Medes, and Babylonians, and included the Greeks, the Italians or Romans, the people of India, and all of the Asian nations as we see them today, or the Indo-Asian nations as we see them today. We'll get into the other ones as much as the rest of Europe. The Caucasus Mountain region, or the Great Caucasus, is where the people of Ashkenaz originate. Their genetic haplotype, their customs, their kingdom, the Khazars, they all come from this area. Below that, what we call Turkey used to be Anatolia. That's another discussion, but that was not originally full of the Persians, the Medes, and the Babylonians, and the other people of Japhet. As stated previously, the Levant region was originally black or full of melanated people, which goes for all the Shemitic or Semitic people of that region, including the ancient IB'RIM or Hebrews. The ancient IB'RIM were and still are a black or dark skinned people today. The whole world knows this except for those of countries with Western education systems that employ their Aryan model of history. After the Jews moved into Palestine after World War II, the Muslim nations, led by the president of Egypt, boycotted the UN partitioning of Palestine to make Israel a state. Many of the Muslim countries, even to this day, do not recognize Israel as a true state. The Western media will have you believe that is because they hate Jews or the common term of anti Semitism is used. This label is cast without any regard for the reasoning of the Muslim nations. This is most evident when reviewing the statement of Gabal al-Nasir, the president of Egypt and leader of the Muslim branch of the UN at the time of all of this. He stated, "You Jews will never be able to live here in peace because you left here black but came back white. We cannot accept you." End quote. That is 1952. So this is why there's so much tension in the region today. Question 12. If Caucasians are not Anglos, or what we would call the white nation, then who are the Anglos? The Anglos, or the Anglo-Saxons, consist of the people of Scandinavia. This is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Denmark. And there are many theories as to the origin of the white race or white nation, who are also known commonly as the Anglos or Anglo-Saxons. But this video will focus on the facts as well as the few accounts which utilize the ancient model of history as opposed to the revised Aryan one, as well as their review of their DNA. The origin or lineage of the white nation can be subdivided into two distinct groups, which are, of course, two distinct haplogroups that make up these distinct nations. The Norse are haplogroup N or Finnic, and the Anglo-Saxon are haplogroup I or Scandinavian. The first thing to understand is that the white nation did not show up on the world stage until less than about 2,000 years ago. The term Anglo means the same as the word angel and describes a group of people also called the Angles. In Latin is Angli. They were one of the main Germanic tribes who settled in Great Britain in the post-Roman period. These Germanic people founded several of the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons in England, and their name is the root of the name England. The name references a region called Angolan, an area located on the Baltic shore of what is now the Schleswig-Holstein. The two works of Tacitus that span the history of the Roman Empire detailed a lot of the Germanic tribes' formations, their customs, and their migration patterns. If more information is desired, you can look into his writings to find out. The earliest recorded mention of the Angles is probably in chapter 40 of Tacitus's Germania, written around 98 CE. Tacitus describes the Angli as one of the more remote Subetic tribes compared to the Semnonians and Langobardi, who lived in the Elbe and were better known to the Romans than the Angli. So the Romans didn't really know much about them. He little specifics as to their origins or geographical status, but states that, together with the six other tribes, they all worshipped Nerthus, or Mother Earth, whose sanctuary was located on an island in the ocean. And the cult of Nerthus, as described by Tacitus, are to be found in pre-Christian Scandinavia, especially in the Swedish and Danish religions. So this is what you get the concept of what we understand as paganism right now, nature worship and all that kind of things. The term Saxon means sword or long knife, and the Saxons were a group of Germanic tribes first mentioned as living near the North Sea coast of what is now called Germany, Old Saxony, during the late Roman Empire. They were frequently recorded as raiding and settling in many North Sea areas, as well as pushing south inland towards the Franks, or what we call today the French, who are not originally Anglo-Saxons. Large number of Saxons settled all over Great Britain in the early Middle Ages and formed part of the merged group of Anglo-Saxons who eventually organized the first United Kingdom of England, which was not the first kingdom of Britain, but it was the first kingdom of England. Many Saxons did not remain in Germania or Old Saxony, which was from about 531 to 804 CE, where they resisted the expanding Frankish Empire through the leadership of the semi-legendary Saxon hero Wickhund, who lived there until about 785 CE, or the Common Era. The term Germanic peoples, also called Teutonic, Suebian, or Gothic in older literature, describes the early European ethno-linguistic or racial language group of Northern European origin. They are identified by their use of Germanic languages, large size and fair complexions, red blonde hair, and resistance to cold climates. The blue here in the illustration on the shows the Anglos and the Saxons, or what you would call the white nations, incursion into Europe, and they conquered all of it as far as North Africa. Their size is attested to in many writings, especially from the Romans, who had early contact with them, who described many to be over 7 feet tall and caused fear in their soldiers. This is a drawing called Germanic Thing, or Governing Assembly, which was drawn after the depiction in a relief of the column of Marcus Aurelius, 193 CE, where you can see their large size in comparison to the horses. Germania was inhabited mostly by Germanic tribes, but also by Celts, early Slavs, Balts, and Scythians, who were not Anglo Saxon or Norse, but rather of the same origin as the Greek, Roman, and Persians. The population mix changed over time by assimilation, and especially by migration, which gives us the R1A haplogroup, or the Eastern European haplogroup. And the source of the population mix and R1B, or Western Europe haplogroup, which is the migrational haplotype mutation from mixing throughout Europe. This is the second most recent haplogroup and thus major paternal haplotype mutation behind T. Each haplotype changes or mutates and gives us a new one. This one is a few behind T, which is stated as the primary haplotype of Sephardic Jews, or the second largest group of the three in the Jewish population. The genetic origin is unknown, but as you can see from this chart, anyone can go find one for themselves of the R haplogroup, RU106 and RP312, and their origins. If you look down the bottom, you have Anglo-Saxon and Nordic right there. This is part of the migrational pattern discussed earlier. It is unknown the origin of this haplogroup beyond their own written and oral traditions. They have a history of humanity that starts with a single male and a single female called Ask and Emba, but also involves mixing of the gods that produce a race called Jotun, which were giants of the ice regions, or ice giants. In Old Norse, a scare literally means ash tree, but the etymology of Embla has yet to be determined, with two potential meanings generally accepted by today. The first meaning, elm tree, and is reached by deriving elm la from al melon and subsequently to almer or elm. And the second suggestion is vine, which is reached through ambilo, which may have been related to the Greek term ampilos, itself meaning vine, liana. So their creation story is basically a man and a woman, involves a tree with the gods bestowing gifts or abilities on them, and at the same time creating another race aside from humans that were giants. Sounds familiar? And another question should be, could Jutland refer to Jotun? Who knows? One thing is certain, they have genetics that are outside the traditional scope of modern humans. This may also explain why Neanderthal DNA, which has not been found to be human in origin, is found in all non African nations. The remnants of Neanderthal DNA in the genes of non African modern humans are linked to a range of health problems, including type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and biliary cirrhosis. Indigenous people from sub-Saharan Africa whose ancestors did not migrate out of the continent to breed with Eurasian Neanderthals carry little to no Neanderthal DNA. Between 2% and 4% of the genome of Europeans and Asians is believed to be a legacy of interbreeding between ancient Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Now, there needs to be another conversation about Neanderthals because someone will watch this and assume that this is a slight, but you must understand the view of history on what Neanderthals are to like head scratching monkeys into what probably was the case from beings who were larger and had larger brain capacities and their true origins is a discussion for another video. But I suggest anybody look into it for themselves. The early Anglo-Saxon period covers the history of medieval Britain that starts from the end of the Roman rule. It is a period widely known in European history as the Migration period, also as Volkerwanderung or migrations of peoples in German. This was a period of intensified human migration in Europe from about 400 CE to 800 CE or the Common Era. The migrants were Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, Suebi, Frisi, etc. These were raiding tribes that pillaged and raped with reckless abandon. The term vandalize is derived from the Vandals and still means wanton destruction even to this day. Just as the Medo-Persians pushed out the black Shemitic people of the Levant, they themselves were pushed out by the Greeks, who were later pushed out by the Romans, who themselves were pushed out by the Vikings, who had ended the Roman rule over the world. The primary reason the Anglo-Saxon incursion into Europe was possible is due to the need of assistance in dealing with tribal warfare in Britain after the Roman rule. Gildas, who lived from 500 to 570 of the Common Era, also known as Gildas the Wise or Gildas Sapiens, was a 6th century British monk who has a writing dated to 540 CE that mentions that sometime in the 5th century, a council of leaders in Britain agreed that some of the land in the east of southern Britain will be given to the Saxons on the basis of a treaty, a foedus, by which the Saxons would defend the Britons against attacks from the Picts and Scotti in exchange for food supplies. The most contemporaneous textual evidence is the Chronica Gallica of 452, which records for the year 441, quote, the British provinces, which to this time had suffered various defeats and misfortunes, are reduced to Saxon rule, end quote. It is clear from DNA, history, and archaeology that the Europeans of today were not the aboriginal inhabitants of the land and that they migrated from the northern regions of the world and are comprised of unknown genetic origins. The Rh negative lines and other DNA anomalies of the Anglo should be looked into, but cannot be possibly covered in the totality of this video. Again, this is not to promote a race or denounce another race, just looking at the genetics, the facts, without bias, without hate. Question 13. Why did race become such a factor in the account of history? First, it is important to understand that ancient times the world was not divided into color lines, but rather by nationality or the tribal names of their ancestors. The Greeks and the Romans were no exception to this practice, and the concept of racial lines being along the phenotype or color of a person stemmed from Europe because they did not have a great civilization prior to or after the Greeks and the Roman ones fell. Humanity as a whole was identified by their tribal names like the Ethiopians or Cushites, Visigoths, Vandals, Saxons, Arabs, Babylonians, Moors, Yahudim or Jews, etc. The center of the intellectual world has always existed in Africa, prior to the 19th century or the 1800s CE. Therefore, during the Middle Ages, the 5th to 15th century CE, when the Anglo Saxon expansion into Europe really got rolling, Europe functioned in relative darkness in terms of culture, civilization, but they excelled in warfare. This was the Dark Ages, which included the Anglo Saxon or Norse migration period discussed earlier of 400 to 800 CE, that began in earnest at the end of the Western Roman Empire and continued until after the end of the Saliculum Obscurum or Dark Age in the history of the papacy, running from 904 to 964 CE. Everything flowed in sequential order. As soon as they conquered and moved over the region, all of a sudden Rome's papacy got out of sync. This is when the original inhabitants of Britain, Germany, and most Western Europe were pushed out by the Viking incursion into Europe. This is the reason that there exist so many pre-Renaissance family crests that were depicted with Negro or black patriarchs. These are examples of black family crests in Europe. It is typically known that during the Muslim era of the Iberian Peninsula, this was about the 8th century CE to about the 15th century CE, whereas in 1492 we know that Spain expelled all the Moors. A lot of people of dark skin lived in that region. Some of them were coats dedicated to Saint Maurice, but a lot of them just were coats dedicated to their families, which were black. After the end of the Dark Ages, this new Europe, that was now largely populated by Scandinavian or Anglo tribes, was beginning to establish themselves as the new ruling civilization of the world. This resulted in the Renaissance period of Europe. The Renaissance was a period in European history from the 14th to the 17th century, where most of the art we currently utilize for history was created. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Renaissance art includes painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and literal production during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries in Europe under the combined influences of an increased awareness of nature, a revival of classical learning, and a more individualistic view of man. Most pieces of this period are of a biblical nature and almost always involve purely white or Anglo people being depicted. This includes the Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, which was depicted before with another version of the Last Supper, as well as the infamous Sistine Chapel. These were all products of the Renaissance era. When this period ended, the new classical view of the world began with it, and a departure from the medieval understanding of the world and a more racial superior one began. The first to divide humanity based on phenotype was a German named Johann F. Blumenbach. He lived from 1752 to 1840 CE. He was a German physician, naturalist, physiologist, and anthropologist, and was one of the early eugenic practitioners, or those who believed in the white racial superiority and improvement. These people were the first to explore the study of mankind as an aspect of natural history. His teachings in comparative anatomy were applied to his classification of human races into 5 categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, Indians or Native Americans, and Malayans. Of course, they placed Caucasians as the original race of all mankind. This man is often referred to as the father of modern anthropology, or the study of humans. But notice he classifies the black race using the national marker of Ethiopia and not the phenotype of black or Negro. Notice how this man applied his racial understanding or worldview into his concept of races or nations. The application of color hadn't become full blown yet, but the Aryan model began to replace the tried and true ancient model of history, based almost solely on the new European concept of racial superiority and almost nothing more. Question 14. How did the ancient EIB'RIM, or Hebrews, get into the west coast of Africa if they originated in the Levant region? Now, with the proper context of how the Aryan model was facilitated and the view of the world was distorted, we can move on to the actual migrational patterns of these people, how the ancient Israelites or Israelites got into the west coast of Africa. As you can see from these two illustrations, the migrational patterns are quite simple. They went from the Fertile Crescent and moved into Africa. But we will go with context and a historical record. The migration into the west coast of Africa actually starts with the Ashur or Assyrian empires conquering of the Levant, which predates the Medo-Persian incursion into the Levant region. This nation, or Ashur, under the rule of Shalmaneser V, who was king of Assyria from 727 to 722 BCE, took the northern kingdom of Lachish into captivity. This was displayed earlier in the slide of the relief found in the British Museum of History. So this was nearly 3,000 years ago. And the earliest record of this individual was as governor of Zamira, which is Zamar, and accredited by Maurice Dunnard and N. Salisbury to be the archaeological site of Tel Gazel in 1957 CE. He led Phoenicia in the reign of his father, Tilgath-Pileser III, both of which are attested to in the Assyrian kings list as well as the writings of the ancient EIB'RIM. The Assyrian Empire, or the Empire of Ashur, enclosed the whole of the Fertile Crescent and Levant, all the way up to the Caucasus Mountains, and what we call Persia. The name Shalmaneser is used for him in the Ibri Sepharim, or the Hebrew books, what we typically call the Bible, which recognizes him as the ruler who led the final conquest of the kingdom of Shomron, which is Samaria or the northern kingdom of Israel, and the deportation of the Israelites recorded in 2 Kings, chapters 17 through 18. Shalmaneser accused Hoshea, king of Israel, of conspiring against him by sending messengers to Pharaoh Oscaron IV of ancient KHAMET. According to the accounts of the ancient EIB'RIM, the 10 northern tribes, which made up those who were of Lachish and made up the northern kingdom of Israel, were taken from Shomeron or Samaria, not to be confused with Samaria, into Ashur or Assyria. There's an account of the travel and migration patterns of that particular group of people recorded within the EIB'RIM Sepharim in Ezra Beit, or Second Esdras. This excerpt is chapter 13, verses 40 through 45. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoner out of their own land in the time of Hoshea the king, whom Shalmaneser the king of Assyria led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, which was the Euphrates rivers, and so came they into another land. This line of text is clearly attesting to the identification of the northern kingdom, or the 10 northern tribes of Israel, being taken captive into Ashur or Assyria by the king Shalmaneser across the Euphrates River, which was a divide of that empire as well as the dividing line for Asia and Africa. Verse 41. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, meaning the Assyrians, and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. So the northern kingdom decided to leave the Asher Empire and go into a further land that was unsettled by mankind. Verse 42. That they might there keep their statues, which they never kept in their own land. The keeping of rituals and or customs of the EIB'RIM is a key part of their civilization. It is always an identifying marker of this nation of people. This nation will practice circumcision of males on the 8th day of life, cleansing or separation days for women on their cycle, and the avoidance of particular types of food is just a few examples of markers of the society of people. Verse 43. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. This verse clearly states they went into the Euphrates on foot at the most narrow places possible for the purpose of crossing it. Verse 44. For the awe of Elohim then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. Here the author explains that the deity of this nation of people, Yisrael, which is also known as awe of Elohim, or the deity of deities, which is commonly translated as the Most High, he stopped the flood of water in the Euphrates so that they were able to pass over the river. Verse 45. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely a year and a half, and the same region is called Asareth. So the northern kingdom, or the 10 northern tribes, traveled for a great distance over the course of 1.5 years through the land, which the author describes as being called Asareth. To travel west from the Euphrates, which is going back across the river from the Asher Empire, will lead you further into Africa. There is a trail in America on the East Coast called the Appalachian Trail. It takes experienced hikers between 5 and 7 months, with the average being about a week or two shy of 6 months to go this distance. The distance traversed is roughly 2,000 miles and is a trail that has been made accessible for hiking purposes. For a large population of people consisting of 10 tribes carrying livestock, elderly, and children through dense jungle, over hills and mountains, it would have assuredly taken a bit longer. The Igbo tribes of southeastern Nigeria are one of the 3 main tribes that make up the country, and they have oral traditions and customs that state they are Ebre or Hebrew people, and Igbo was originally Ibu, which was their dialectic way of saying Hebrew. The north is the House of Fulani, and it is Islamic and feudalistic, whereas the west is the Yoruba. So those are the 3 groups of people or tribes that make up the country of Nigeria. The Igbo claim they traveled 3,000 miles and settled in the region we currently call Nigeria almost 3,000 years ago, which fits the timeline and direction of the northern kingdom according to the written traditions of the ancient EIB'RIM. The Igbo had an oral tradition, which meant there wasn't a developed system of writing except amongst their secret societies. This is also true of the Yoruba aristocracy, who are the western tribe of Nigeria, and again one of the main 3. The Igbo and the Yoruba utilize what is called the Nsibidi script, which was something only those involved with the priesthood could understand. Linguistically, they both are part of what is called the Kwa language group. This is part of the same language group as other Bantu West African nations, such as the Ashanti of Ghana, as well as the Beni. They are all comprised of a different nation that is united by linguistics and customs. So, this is a record of the ancient EIB'RIM entering into deep Africa by the 8th century or the 8th millennia BCE. Even upon inspection of the name Africa, you will come to find its Hebraic origins. The continent's name is derived from the descendants of Abraham, who is a major patriarch in Hebraic history and culture. A grandchild of Abraham and Keturah named Aphir or Ophir led a campaign against the nation of Put or Libya, and when it was captured, his grandchildren named the land after their conquering patriarch, Africa. This is attested to even in the first century CE historian Flavian Josephus in The Antiquity of the Jews on page 50. In Latin, the word used for Africa is Aphir, which is just Aphir, as the letter F is interchangeable with PH in many cultures. After this 8th century BCE migration into Africa, there was another huge migration in the 1st century around 70 CE, or the Common Era. This was the destruction of the Second Temple by the Caucasians who controlled the region at the time, the Romans. An excerpt from a book by Dr. Rudolph Windsor, who is a well-established historian and author, sheds light on this topic. Quote, in the year 65 CE, the Roman armies under General Pompey captured Jerusalem. In 70 CE, General Vespasian and his son Titus put an end to the Jewish, or Yehudim, which were the three southern tribes of Yisrael, state, with great slaughter. During the period of the military governors of Palestine, which was Roman Judea, many outrages and atrocities were committed against the residue of the people. During the period from Pompey to Julius, it has been estimated that over 1 million Jews, again the word is Yehudim, there was no J 500 years ago, fled into Africa, fleeing Roman persecution and slavery. The slave markets were full of black Yehudim slaves. From Babylon and Timbuktu, page 84. Dr. Windsor goes on to cite the 1st century BCE into 1st century CE Yehudi philosopher Philo, who lived from 40 BCE to 40 CE in Alexandria, Egypt, and attested to there being about 1 million Yehudim living in Libya from the borders of Egypt to the borders of Ethiopia. During the 1st century BCE into the 1st century CE, Africa was divided into Libya and Ethiopia. Libya was the northern part of, and Ethiopia, or Kush, was the southernmost part. This account also coincides with another of the EIB'RIM writings from a separate author, Sefer Zephaniah, or the Book of Zephaniah, chapter 3, verse 10. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring my offering. Cush is Ethiopia. The author states that the dispersed of Yisrael or Israel will come from beyond the rivers of Cush, which would mean beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. As stated earlier, the continent of Africa was named after someone of the EIB'RIM, or the Hebrews. Is divided by the northern region and the southern region. The southern region was typically designated as Kush or Ethiopia. The northern region was typically designated as Libya. It has also been known in the mid part as Sudan. As Dr. Windsor further notes, Strabo, who was a Greek geographer, philosopher, and historian that lived in Asia Minor or Anatolia, or we call Turkey today, during the transitional period of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, attested to the migration of the Yahudim into North Africa in the 1st century, and more specifically Cyrene. This city is in current-day Libya and clearly African. Strabo states, quote, "Now these Yehudim have already gotten into all the cities, and it is hard to find a place in the habitable earth that is not admitted this tribe of men and not possessed by it. And it has come to pass that Egypt and Cyrene, which is Libya, as having the same governors, and a great many other nations or races, imitate their way of living, and maintain great bodies of these Yehudim in a peculiar or privileged status, and grow up to greater prosperity with them, and make the same laws with that nation." End quote. This individual, Strabo, like Philo, lived in the last century of BCE, or before Common Era, in the first century CE, or the Common Era. These historians were both geographers and thus understood the layout of the Levant region and North Africa. They clearly state and attest that in their day the Yehudim were everywhere. Libya and Egypt were so packed with them that you had trouble finding places on the earth that they were not teeming with Yehudim nation or the Yehudim race. These other nations even went so far as to imitate their customs and keep them as a privileged nation amongst their own. These were black or dark phenotype people that started to mix with other African tribes. There is also the findings of Emil Schurer, who lived from 1844 to 1910 of the Common Era, or CE. He was a German Protestant theologian known primarily for his study of the history of the Yehudim, or the Jews, around the 1st century CE. He wrote Geschichte des jüdischen Volks im Zeitalter Jesu Christi. Forgive my German, but this means a history of the Jewish people in the time of Jesus Christ. This made him one of the most accredited and known of the modern Jewish scholars in Great Britain and in the United States. He noted that the customs of this nation was evident from Egypt going westward across North Africa until you get to Mauritania, which is in Morocco. This nation, or the Yehudim, which was the southern kingdom, or the southern three tribes of Israel, or the ancient EIB'RIM, ancient Hebrews, they occupied and ruled western and southern Africa and a few parts of northern Africa until the Arab slave trade was in full swing around the 7th century. Cities like Timbuktu was the learning center of the world from the 5th century CE until the end of the Dark Ages. People like Mansa Musa, Soni Ali, Muhammad Askia, famous names of African rulers, were of the Yehudim, who ruled in West Africa. The Bantu expansion of Africa and the kingdom of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were all Yisraelite or Israelite nations that were trying to reestablish their system of government and culture after the invasion from the Romans, and started around the 2nd century CE. Tribal wars over religion caused a weakening of this nation that led to the European slave trade in the 16th century CE. But as they spread out, their influence can still be seen in the world today. The ancient EIB'RIM went from the Fertile Crescent to the West Coast in South Africa. Question 15. What about the other nations and their origins? The other nations, such as the Native Americans, who are actually the Aboriginal people of North America, the Asian nations, and the Mexican and Latino tribes, are affected by the Aryan model, and it surely impacted their cultures or civilizations. But there does not exist wholesale confusion by them as to their origins. These nations are basically intact, and a more in-depth video about true world history would explain a lot of factors, such as the African expansion into this continent from the Asians across the Bering Strait and those who came by ship thousands of years before Spain was ever a nation. The Aryan model is imposed on our youth to indoctrinate them into disregarding the history as recorded and accepting the revised based on little more than speculation and racism. Nothing was wrong with the ancient model. It had explanatory power. Accounts of those who were from the periods, and although an obvious display of bias, as there is nothing that exists without some bias, they gave accurate accounts based on the facts of the time. These 15 questions were just a starting point to understanding our individual origins.